go.
Okay, let's have prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you again that we could meet here, and I pray that you will be with each one of us here and those who hear this on the internet or on DVDs. Please help this to be presented clearly so that each of us can read and understand and know the direction you want us to go as we follow you and are used by you to help others. In Jesus' name, amen. So I was reading from Jonah 4, and I was reading about how God created a covering for Jonah by a gourd plant, and then a worm ate that plant and killed it, and it died. And when that died, Jonah was no longer covered. And the sun beat upon him, and Jonah was angry. Jonah was angry with God. And God said to him, you know, you're more concerned about this plant than you are about the people of Nineveh. And so, in studying this, Jonah 4 verse 1, and God prepared a worm when the morning rose the next day. And the worm is the same worm that's found in Deuteronomy 28. And it means, according to the Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, a crimson scarlet worm. A worm covered with red hair. Okay, so this is a worm that is connected to Islam and connected to the beast and the papacy and the connection between the two. And that worm eats the gourd and kills the gourd, and the gourd dies. So Jonah's no longer covered, just like God's people during this time will no longer be covered by what's happening in the most holy place of the sanctuary in heaven. They will have a time of Jacob's trouble, and they will no longer be covered. And in verse 8, it says that God prepared a vehement east wind, and the sun beat upon the head of Jonah. And there's a meaning to what that word, vehement east wind, means. It means a silent, quiet, hot east wind. And the east wind is connected to Islam, but this is a different role that Islam takes at this point. So here we've had the locusts in August 11, 1840, and the locust in September 11, 2001. Those locusts, the word for that was a rapidly increasing locust. But the locust that eats the gourd, is killed by a vehement east wind, a quiet, hot, silent east wind from Islam. This is a different role that Islam takes in prophecy. I don't know that I've heard anyone talk about this before, but the more I studied the Bible, the more I could see that it's there. Okay, so the red worms, or the wine of Babylon, or being drunk with the wine of Babylon, destroys the covering of mercy for God's people. And Jonah is a type of the 144,000 when probation has closed, and the sealing for the 144,000 has occurred. And the vehement east wind brings the Sunday law, as I studied the Bible. And God wants us to see that His purpose is to reach those who are lost in Nineveh, meaning the Gentiles or the world. And He doesn't want us to be angry about the time of trouble that comes with the sealing and the close of probation and the things that God's people go through during that time, because this is a time for the world to have a chance to accept salvation before it's too soon. So that's what I got from understanding and reading in Jonah. So I studied the worms more. I came to Isaiah 14, verse 11. Isaiah 14 talks about the papacy and the beast and all of that in Bible prophecy, and I don't have time to really develop that and as a topic right now. But Isaiah 14 verse 11 reads, Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy viols, meaning a musical instrument. The worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. And so this is spoken about the exaltation of the man of sin, but it also in Isaiah 14 it's about Lucifer and the false Christ who impersonates Christ with the Sunday law. And if you read in verses 12 through 15 and also in verse 13, this person sits upon the sides of the congregation in the sides of the north. And so the worms are there for the purpose of destroying the Antichrist. Okay? So I'm going to read Isaiah 14 verse 13. Sides of the congregation in the sides of the north. And that's in that verse. If you go to Strong's Concordance, the word congregation means an appointment, a fixed time or season, a festival, conventionally a year. By implication, an assembly convened for a definite purpose. Technically, the congregation, by extension, the place of meeting. It's also a signal as appointed beforehand, an appointed sign, time or place of solemn assembly, congregation, synagogue, a set appointed time. So the worms in Isaiah 14 verse 11 are for the purpose of destroying the man of sin, the false Christ who promotes the Sunday law, and those who participate in the solemn assembly of this false worship will also be destroyed. And this is what happens to the unwise virgins. And this also happens to all who participate in the false solemn assembly around worshiping or exalting the false Christ and the false day of worship. When we study further into the story of Jonah, we find an even deeper and more solemn application to those who understand Bible prophecy and yet are not sealed. So, up until this time, we've talked about the worms in Deuteronomy, and the locusts, and the word for worms that is found in Deuteronomy is also found in Jonah chapter 4. It's the same kind of worm that eats the covering over Jonah so that he's not covered from the sun or the Sunday law. He doesn't have a ceiling. And then it's also found in Isaiah 14 verse 11. So there's 3 witnesses to that word, and we want to make sure that we have those witnesses as we're studying this, because this is a word here for worms in these verses that isn't found too many other places in the Bible. So we want to be careful how we understand this. So I'm going to come back to Jonah 4, verse 7. I'm going to read it again. And God prepared a worm when the morning rose the next day, and it smote the gourd, that it withered. And it came to pass, when the sun did arise, that God prepared a vehement east wind, and the sun beat upon the head of Jonah, that he fainted and wished in himself to die. And he said, It is better for me to die than to live. And God said to Jonah, Doest thou well to be angry for the gourd? And he said, I do well to be angry, even unto death. And then the Lord said, Thou hast had pity on the gourd, for the which thou hast not labored, neither madest it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night. And should not I spare Nineveh, that great city wherein are more than 60,000 persons that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle? So, coming to the word vehement in the concordance, it means strong, quiet, sultry, hot wind, east wind, vehement. This is a quiet and hot east wind. This wind destroys the covering over the head of Jonah, allowing the sun or the Sunday law to harm him to the point that he wishes to die. Jonah's experience with this appears to illustrate the experience of those who know and teach God's prophecy but are not sealed. Jonah shows no love for the lost people of Nineveh, And instead of being focused on God's glory, he is focusing on himself when there is a delay and God spares Nineveh. Jonah had a great disappointment when God chose to not destroy Nineveh because they had repented. Now, God is merciful and loving, and the book of Jonah is here, so I believe that Jonah had many chances to be converted, and the fact that the book is there may be an evidence that, you know, Jonah was right with God by the time he wrote that book and told about this story. But this story in the Bible illustrates what we need to know in the last days about the way that God's going to judge who's sealed as part of the 144,000 and who isn't. And it has to do with our love for people, and our wanting to give God glory more than self. So, from this study, I then wrote out, because locusts are the time that we can most clearly identify in the prophetic chain. So the locust, there's in Deuteronomy, where the study on the worms first started, the locust comes first and third, or last. So we have two time periods, and I put them right there. August 11, 1840, second woe with Islam. September 11, 2001, third woe with Islam. And so it would appear to me that up until 9/11, the worms were doing something. Okay? And the more I understand about this palmer worm, the more I think that that has to do with the worms. Because when you look in the concordance, palmer worm is connected to worms, even though it's not actually there in a Bible text. And palmer worm is here, and palmer worm's here. So the palmer worm was in effect up until, if I understand correctly, up until 1798, when Berthier took the Pope out of, arrested him, and the Pope no longer had power. So the palmer worm was in effect there. And so in this time period, it's not an accident that the Bible puts the palmer worm in Joel 2:25 at the end, because that's a time when we're going to have a threefold union. The papacy, the dragon, the false prophet, all of that combined. And that's a time when Islam also plays a role. But if I understand rightly and correctly what's happening, the role that Islam may play at this point is a silent east wind, a hot wind, a destroying wind. And I'll talk about that when we go through studying more on the east wind here. So I started to look up the east wind, and I'm going to try to more quickly go through this and just hit the highlights. If anyone wants these handouts and they want to give me an email address, I will send you these handouts, okay, by email. Genesis 41 has talks about it starting in verse 6. There were 7 thin ears. They were blasted with the east wind. This is the same language that's found in Jonah 4, where the vehement east wind is heating the gourd in Jonah after the gourd was destroyed. The 7 thin ears in verse 7 devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And then the 7 ears in verse 23 withered and were thin, and they were blasted with the east wind. So this is the same language. And then in verse 24, the thin ears devoured 7 good ears. And in verse 25 of Genesis 41, Joseph said to Pharaoh, this dream, where he dreamt 2 different times about the crops being destroyed like this, God has showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. Then it talks again in verse 26 about 7 good kine, or cattle, and 7 good years, and then it goes on to verse 27 that the thin The 7 thin and ill-favored kine, or cattle in other words, that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty years blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. So this is beginning to deepen our understanding about the 2520 prophecy, and I'm not going to be able to really describe a lot about the 2520 today, but it's important to identify that that's in Genesis, or a part of Genesis 41. So in these verses, the east wind blasts silently and with a heat that destroys the years of blessing. When crops and the rain were plenty, the quiet, hot east wind brings economic devastation. So there's several verses throughout the Bible where it explains that the quiet, hot east wind brings economic devastation. So that's what we would look for on this end. Okay. So the quiet, coming to Exodus 10, verse 13 through 15, the Lord, one of the plagues that came during the time of the Exodus against the Egyptians, when God was working on Pharaoh to let his people go free, one of the plagues was the locust. The Lord brought an east wind from the land all that day and all that night. And when it was morning, the east wind brought the locusts. The locusts went over all the land of Egypt. They were very grievous, and before them were not no such locusts as they, neither after them shall be such. They covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened. They ate every herb of the land, they ate the fruit of the trees, they ate everything the hail had left, and there remained not any green thing in the trees or the herbs of the field throughout all the land of Egypt. The quiet, so this is my understanding of reading this, the quiet, hot east wind brings the locust, the Islam woes, and this comes over all the land of Egypt, and they covered the face of the whole earth. That's what it says in Exodus. The effect darkens the entire land or world. There's no green thing, so there's total economic devastation. There were not such locusts as they, neither after them such shall be such. And the language that's used to describe this in Exodus chapter 10 is the same language that's found in Joel 1 and Joel chapter 2 about the two armies. So when the language in the Bible is similar, we should make a note of that. Okay. So moving to Exodus chapter 14, starting in verse 21. The Israelites came through the Red Sea. God opened the Red Sea up. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Verse 22, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall between them on their right hand and their left. So, verse 23, the Egyptians pursued, they went after them. Pharaoh, all his chariots, his horses, his horsemen. And then it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and he troubled the host of the Egyptians. Verse 25, and so the Egyptians took off their chariot wheels, that they had drive them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. Verse 26, and the Lord said unto Moses, stretch out thine hand over the sea and the waters, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and upon their horsemen. Verse 27, and Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the water returned to its strength when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians fled against it, and the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. So, in Exodus chapter 14, the east wind divides the class of worshipers, separating those who are the world or Egypt and who are seeking to harm God's people. And the east wind dries up the land and the waters, separating the two classes of worshipers. God's people are the first to walk on the dry ground as God parts the waters. The second class of worshipers seek too late to walk on the dry ground and are destroyed by the waters, and the armies of Egypt or Rome are destroyed. So we've had some examples of the east wind bringing economic devastation, and here's an example of the east wind destroying the armies of Rome or of Egypt. Okay. Psalms 48 verse 7 talks about breaking the ships of Tarshish with an east wind. Tarshish is symbolic of Babylon and of the papacy. Psalms 78:26, he caused an east wind to blow in the heaven, and by his power he brought in the south wind. And I'm not sure what the south wind means, but this is an example of the east and the south wind together. So the east wind brings economic destruction to Tarshish, and similar references could be found in Revelation 18, where it talks about the economic devastation. Isaiah chapter 27, starting in verse 8, he stayeth his rough wind in the day of the east wind. By this therefore shall the iniquity of Jacob be purged, and this is all the fruit to take away his sin. And so I'm going to go down to verse 12 of Isaiah 27. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall beat off from the channel of the river into the stream of Egypt, and ye shall be gathered one by one, O ye children of Israel. Verse 13, and it shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and they shall worship the Lord in the holy mount of Jerusalem. So during the day of the east wind, a day of the great trumpet, God's people who recognize what is happening will be purged or cleansed, and they will lay aside false worship and idols. And this is a gathering time, at a time when Egypt, spiritualism, atheism in the world, and Assyria, Babylon, and the outcasts, the Gentiles, have a chance to turn to worship the true God. And so it's important to understand what that means about the great trumpet. There is a connection to 9/11, but there may be some other connections, and I would encourage everyone to continue to study that. Jeremiah 18 talks about, in verse 15, because my people have forgotten me, they have burned incense to vanity, and they have caused them to stumble in their ways from the ancient paths, to walk in paths in a way not cast up. Verse 17, I will scatter them as with an east wind before the enemy. I will show them the back and not the face in the day of their calamity. Verse 18, then they said, come, let us devise devices against Jeremiah, for the law shall not perish from the priest, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. Come, and let us smite him with the tongue, and let us not give heed to any of his words. So Jeremiah is talking about the 2520, the law of God, the covenant that God calls each of us to. Effectually, Jeremiah was talking about these charts, the application for today. And he's talking about this, and he's presenting these truths, and he's trying to call people back to their covenant with God, to be healed and freed from sin. And the people say, come, let us smite him with the tongue. Because they know that if they can smite him with their tongues and discount what he's presenting, and that's their goal. That's what they want to have happen. So Jeremiah calls out to God in chapter 18, verse 19, give heed to me, O Lord, and hearken to the voice of them that contend with me. Shall evil be recompensed for good? For they have digged a pit for my soul. Remember that I stood before thee to speak good for them, and to turn away thy wrath from them. And it goes on to talk about how he did that. Verse 22, let a cry be heard from their houses when thou shalt bring a troop suddenly upon them, for they have digged a pit to take me and hid snares for my feet. So that's what they were doing. And in Jeremiah's case, they actually dug a pit filled with miry clay and mud and cold, and he was an old man, and they threw him in that pit expecting him to die. And God used someone who was a slave or servant to the king, to the evil, wicked king who came and freed him. Verse 23, yet, Lord, thou knowest of their counsel against me. Forgive not their iniquity, neither blot out their sin from thy sight, but let them be overthrown before thee. Deal thus with them in the time of your anger. So the Bible talks about the time of his anger and the day of the Lord. And here Jeremiah had pleaded with God on their behalf to save them from destruction and wrath and save them from the sin. But finally then it got to a point where he said, no, don't blot out their sin. So that's prophetic. So from these verses, the time of the east wind has both a scattering and a gathering. It's important to notice that when we're studying the prophecies about the east wind. And those who use their tongue as a sword to fight, or those who use their tongue as a sword or a fist to smite those who have spoken for God, will not be protected in the day of his wrath or anger. Those who are contentious and try to catch someone in a word or a pit or lay snares for them will not have their sins blotted out in the time of God's anger. Those who are sealed will be those who have had a heart to stand in the gap for others, as Jeremiah did, and to speak good in their prayers and speech for them, so as to turn them away, so that they will not be caught unawares during the time of God's wrath. So there's a progression, as I've studied what the east wind means and the worms, there's a progression in the Bible as to what this means to us today. Ezekiel 17, verse 10, yea, behold, being planted shall it prosper, shall it not utterly wither when the east wind touches it? Verse 12, behold, the king of Babylon is come to Jerusalem, and hath taken the king thereof, and the princes thereof, and led them with him to Babylon, and hath taken of the king's seed, and made a covenant with him, and hath taken an oath of him. So the time of the east wind withers economic prosperity, and it's also a time that brings a covenant or agreement between Babylon, Jerusalem, and the leaders or nations that are connected to Jerusalem. So there's a threefold union. Jeremiah 19, verse 10, thy mother is like a vine in her blood, going down to verse 12. But she was plucked up in fury. She was cast down to the ground, and the east wind dried up her fruit. This sounds like the gourd in Jonah that was eaten by the worm. It says the fire consumed them. And in verse 13, and now she is planted in the wilderness in a dry and thirsty ground. And a fire is gone out of a rod of her branches, which hath devoured her fruit, so that she hath no strong rod to be a scepter to rule. This is a lamentation, and shall be for a lamentation. So the east wind dries up and destroys the economy once again. And fire and wilderness are also key concepts that are taught and found in studying the book of Joel. Okay, so that brings us back to restudying Joel, where it talks about those words. Jeremiah 27, verse 24, talks about the merchants and how the ships of Tarshish did sing of thee in thy market, in verse 25. In verse 26, the east wind hath broken thee in the midst of the seas. And it talks about the destruction economically of all the riches and the wealth that was there for Tarshish. So the east wind once again breaks the economy and the strength of Tarshish. Hosea 12 verse 1. Ephraim feedeth on wind, and followeth after the east wind. He daily increaseth lies and desolation, and they do make a covenant with the Assyrians, and oil is carried into Egypt. So there's the east wind, the Assyrians in Egypt. There is a covenant between them, and Ephraim is feeding on the east wind. The Lord hath also a controversy with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. According to his doings will he recompense him. Recompense is found in Joel. There's a meaning to that word. But God's intention was that the curse, the 2520, the curse of sin, that Jesus took that for us. And here, they're getting the results of the 2520 curse. Hosea 12, verse 9. I am the Lord thy God from the land of Egypt, and will yet make thee to dwell in tabernacles in the days of the solemn feast. I have also spoken by the prophets, and I have multiplied visions and used similitudes, in other words, parables, by the ministry of the prophets. So, God's people make a covenant with Babylon, Assyria, and their oil, or the Holy Spirit, is lost to Egypt, the world, atheism, and spiritualism. And this happens during the time of the east wind, which is also a time of the worms. And this is a time when the east wind is silent and cold and silent and hot and quiet. And recompense means being punished justly or according to his doing. And then I have a question. Is Ephraim, Israel, and Jerusalem God's glorious holy mountain? Found in Daniel 11:45. Does this mean God's covenant keeping people? Or is this the glorious land found in Daniel 11:41, meaning the United States? And this is important because during the time of the east wind, Ephraim feeds on the wind and follows after the east wind and increases lies daily and makes a covenant with the powers that are symbolized by Egypt, or by Assyria and Egypt. And we see this happening in the news and all around us today. But those who go through the time of trouble, the time of Jacob's trouble, and they prevail as Jacob did, will also benefit from and take seriously the ministry of the prophets and the visions, and they will experience the solemn assembly, the joy, including joy and gladness that's found in the Feast of Tabernacles. So there's a comparison between the wise and the foolish virgins and the two classes of worshipers there. And you find this everywhere. You read about this in the Bible. So Jeremiah 13, verse 15, though he be fruitful among his brethren, an east wind shall come. The wind of the Lord shall come up from the wilderness, and his spring shall become dry, and his fountain shall be dried up, and he shall spoil the treasure of all pleasant vessels. So I'm going to go to Ezekiel 13, verse 15. Wait a minute. Correction. I want to compare Ezekiel 13, verse 15 and Joel. Oh, I just read Ezekiel 13, 15. I'm sorry. And Joel, in chapter 1 of Joel, both talk about the wilderness. And this is the time when the persecution starts. It's a time of a second 1260, in my opinion, and I found this studying Joel. I presented that last time when I presented about Joel. So I'm going to read the texts that have to do with this. In Joel 1, verses 19 through 20, O Lord, to thee will I cry, for the fire hath devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and the flame hath burned all the trees of the field. The beasts of the field cry unto thee, for the rivers of waters are dried up, and the fire hath devoured the pastures of the wilderness. Revelation 12:6, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Revelation 12, verse 14, and to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished, for a time, times and a time from the face of the serpent. And going back to Ezekiel 13, verse 15, though he be fruitful among his brethren, an east wind shall come, the wind of the Lord, shall come up from the wilderness, and his spring shall become dry, and his fountain shall be dried up, and he shall spoil the treasures of all pleasant vessels. So, I'm going to read in connection with this, Revelation 12, verse 17. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which have the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. So there's in this second persecution, with all these verses that I've been reading, in the wilderness, there's a difference between those who are following God, who are following God's solemn assembly and the covenant with God with that, versus those who are following the false solemn assembly. And so the wilderness to the false worshipers becomes a wilderness. And the wilderness to God's people it becomes a place of salvation and hope and God saving and protecting them. And I heard in Daniel 12:7, and I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, and that it shall be for a time, times and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. Daniel 12, verses 8 through 10. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So if we understand correctly, if we're wise virgins and we understand that there will be a second persecution, not a literal 1260 years, but it will be a figurative replay of what happened during the 1260 persecution. If we understand that and what occurs during the time of Jacob's trouble and the time of the Sunday law, then we will understand what will happen with us, with God's people who are in that wilderness experience, and we'll be prepared. And no murmuring. Yeah. So, I'm going to go to Hosea, and I'm going to end in Habakkuk.